13.2 Contemporary Issues in Sport, BETH GATES. In modern-day sport, there are many issues around topics such as gender, race, religion, violence, politics, and many others. There are arising schemes within sport to eradicate these issues. However, they are still ongoing. For example, campaigns to keep racism out of football have been present for many years. However, England players such as Raheem Sterling received mass racist abuse from Bulgaria fans in an international fixture just last week. There are clear efforts to make positive changes surrounding the issues in sport. In this case, there were specific procedures to follow by the officials, mass coverage of the incident, and further campaigning as a result. However, the issues are still very much present in our football to this day. Football is one of the sports with the most media coverage, therefore you're going to see the most issues in this sport as these issues get more coverage. There's also a certain culture within this sport that perhaps is a cause for each of these issues to be so prevalent, which is why I'm going to focus on football as a sport and the issues within it. So the first issue I'm going to talk about is violence in football. Violence is not something that is new to football, it's something that has occurred in the sport since its origins. So modern day football is a developed and more rule-orientated version of mob football, the starting point for football in the 14th century. Mob football was exactly as it sounds, a congested crowd of people fighting against each other to score. Sport was played between two neighbouring villages, creating a rivalry, and there was one aim for the sport: carry the ball, which was an inflated pigskin at the time, to the other end of the village. Due to the violent nature of medieval peasants, which was the predominant competitors, there was one rule put in place: murder and manslaughter are prohibited. Other than that, you can use any method you wish to get the ball to the end of the other village. As you can use any means except for murder and manslaughter, people took advantage of this and used any acts of violence they could get away with, especially due to it being against other villages and having that initial rivalry. The sport became so violent that over time the authorities gained the grounds to stop it. Mob football is where our modern day football stemmed from, which would explain why violence is such a big issue in the culture of football in the present day. This includes violence between players and acts of violence by spectators. These acts of violence are nowhere near as severe as they were in mob football, mainly due to the introduction of rules and guidelines which have developed over time. Over time, of course, you can see that mob football eventually developed into a sport played at university level when universities were introduced, and that is of course where the introduction of rules occurred, and these rules then developed over time with the sport and with the culture to become safer and aim to prevent less intentional acts of violence, hence the use of yellow cards and red cards for acts of violence that could put the opposition at harm. There are different forms of violence in football, and the main reasons for these acts of violence are frustration, competitiveness, retaliation, increases in arousal, and stimulation by others. There are of course other factors that play into these, however, the factors are kind of specific to performers or spectators, as the violence that occurs is different. So, player violence is obviously violence that occurs between players on the pitch. It's no violence between any spectators, it's just the players on the pitch. There could be many reasons for player violence, so for example, a player might be frustrated with a decision. Perhaps the referee gave a decision that went in the opposition's favour, so the player retaliates with violence. This would of course relate to the frustration aggression theory of frustration leads to aggression. The player doesn't agree with the decision, therefore they retaliate with violence as a result of that frustration with the decision. This might be making rougher tackles or acting out against the opposition in an aggressive manner. Another cause of violence might be just natural competitiveness. So this might be displays of aggression and violence because the player wants to beat the opposition to the ball, perhaps. So they might go in for a really forceful challenge just to beat that player to the ball or to gain an advantage, perhaps, over the opposition. Now, those two can obviously be described as assertion or to gain advantage, perhaps instrumental aggression. You might be stopping someone from going through on goal. But overall competitiveness might be a driving force for that violence. Another link back to the frustration aggression theory is that a player might perhaps be frustrated with their own performance or their team's performance and therefore retaliate with aggression and henceforth retaliating with violence as a result of that aggression. This might be acting with aggression on the opposition or potentially even with their own teammates. They are examples of teammates lashing out at each other in the middle of a game, having disagreements with each other in a game over their performance, perhaps sometimes acting with violence. More commonly, though, this act of aggression or violence would be on the opposition. So you can see here on the slide an example of this aggression on an opposition player. So you can see French player Zidane in this incident actually headbutted his opposition in the chest. He did consequently get sent off for this, of course, as it is not allowed in the game at all. But yeah, this is of course an obvious act of player violence and something that needs to be eradicated from the sport, as it's an intent to harm and no intention. It wasn't even part of the play. The ball was nowhere near either of those players. It was more Zidane retaliating to a supposed comment by the opposition player. Either way, violence like this, there's no place for it in the sport, which is why he consequently got sent off for it. Overall, if you look at the main factor influencing player violence, it's usually influencing factors within the game, whether this be the score, your team's performance, your coach's words, perhaps they are speaking in an aggressive manner, which encourages you to act aggressively, or retaliating to the opposition if they start putting in a rougher tackle. You might retaliate and put in an even rougher tackle, and the violence level increases and increases until it becomes dangerous. You can see that all of these factors are situational and dependent on the game and the situation in the game. The type of aggression is also another talking point. Where are the limits and where are the boundaries in terms of violence? Obviously, within violence you have assertion, so that's where you have no intent to harm the player. You have instrumental aggression, where the main focus is actually just to stop the player, so perhaps to stop them from scoring. You might make a strong tackle that could harm them and through your violence, but it is not intending to harm them specifically, it is intending to stop them from scoring. And then you of course have hostile aggression, which is where there is intent to harm. So the obvious line that you draw from this is that hostile aggression should have no place in the sport at all. There should be no intent to harm a player at any point in the sport, which is why we obviously have that introduction of yellow cards and red cards, and why the guidelines and rules around receiving red cards and yellow cards have changed and developed over time with the sport and the culture of the sport. So obviously hostile aggression is a definite no. But where do we draw the line when it comes to assertion and instrumental aggression? Do the players receive as much of a harsh punishment when they're not actually intending to harm the player? Does it depend on the severity of the injury that the opposition receives as a result of the violence? Where do we draw the line when it comes to this violence? Because there's no intent to actually harm anyone. It's intent to play the sport and to achieve a positive result from it. So where do we draw the line there? And is that a blurred line that needs to become clearer among the FA's rules in the sport? Would the sport perhaps lose some of its engagement, would lose some of its excitement if it didn't have these acts of instrumental aggression where players come in with those strong tackles to try and stop a player being through on goal? It's clear that there is a blurred line in the FA's guidelines surrounding the boundaries of violence and aggression in football. It's clear, there's clear arguments in every football match you will watch. There will be arguments surrounding specific tackles, specific decisions by referees surrounding strong tackles. There'll be arguments across social media, arguments on the punditry as well, which shows there's a clear lack of specific guidelines surrounding it, and there needs to be more of a discussion higher up in the sport with the governing bodies such as the FA around violence and aggression and what is accepted and what isn't. Obviously it's always going to be hard to have specifics because you can't single out every specific act of violence and act of aggression because they're so different to each other and so dependent on circumstances. So it's hard to do that. But perhaps there needs to be more of a discussion within these governing bodies of the sport surrounding the laws and rules of the sport. Football's a developing sport and the rules need to develop with it. Of course, whilst there are many issues with player violence in football, you'll see interactions between players with a nature of violence in today's football. You'll see quite a few of them. However, there are increasing amounts of punishments towards these players now. The sport's developed to try and become less violent, less aggressive, which is why you'll see more of these players being punished with match bans, fines and things like that. Now obviously this will be more of a discussion point later on as I'll talk about the methods of prevention for player and spectator violence. But perhaps in terms of fines and bans, perhaps they need to be longer, more detrimental to the player's career. Players earn millions these days and are fined a couple thousand. It doesn't really impact them enough to make them think twice about what they've done.